less about what you can make out of native plants, and more about the ways that native plants relate to each other and to our food system. So if you really think about it, excluding spices, most people in this room have probably eaten about 100 different plants in their life, right? You have several different types of major grains, you have several different types of legumes, you have your fruits and your vegetables, those kinds of classic things that you can buy at the grocery store. But there are about 10,000 plants present in Alabama. There are 5,000 native ones and about 5,000 non-native ones. And about 1 every 10 of those plants is edible in some way. And about 30% of those plants is medicinal in some way. So if you really think about that, that's about 1,000 plant species around you that you could be eating and probably never have. What's so cool about that is that whenever we think about climate change and land use disruption, when we think about like the processes of colonization, what we're actually talking about is the ways that we've decided to construct our homes and our food systems. That's really what it comes down to. Right now in America, we have a lot of very, very large, very, very mechanized monocrop farmlands that are using exact genetic copies of each other's seeds so that they can grow the exact same food everywhere. And that's not very resilient in a lot of ways, although it is highly productive. One of the main reasons that our current agricultural system is able to feed so many people is because of the C4 gene in corn, which allows it to respond incredibly well to petroleum-based fertilizers. So all that oil that's coming out of the ground, it's not just burned in your car, it's also used to grow your corn. And then that corn forms the basis of all of our animal agriculture. Almost everything that you eat that is made of meat is fed largely on corn. Well, corn is native to here. However, the types of corn that we grow now are very, very narrow selections of corn, and they're not grown in the traditional methods. Many of you have probably heard of the Three Sisters garden. So in the traditional model of the Three Sisters garden, you have corn, squash, and beans. Now there's lots of different kinds of beans, and there's lots of different kinds of squash. With this model, you typically want a low-growing squash, and you want a climbing bean. And the beans fix the nitrogen, the squash keeps any other weeds from growing, and then the corn provides basically a bean pole for the bean climb. And that is a much more sustainable system. However, there are a lot of indigenous groups in the United States prior to colonization that actually use up to 30 different plants in their Three Sisters approach. You can grow sunflowers, hypernicums, you can grow all sorts of things with it. In fact, a lot of them use multiple types of sunflowers. They would use what we call a sunchoke, which is a sunflower with an edible tuber. And then they would also use a seed-bearing sunflower as well. And they would interplant those among the rows of corn and the squash and the beans, right? But field farming is also not the main way that a lot of people prior to colonization in this area got their food. They were agriculturalists. They did have many, many plants that they harvested, did their little field rows, right, like we do. But a lot of the other stuff that they did was that they foraged and they intentionally managed landscapes to make them good for foraging. In this area, that largely looked like controlled burns. Controlled burns reset ecological succession. So if you've ever seen them clear out a big piece of property to build a housing complex, and they lose all the money before they finish building anything, you know a little bit about ecological succession. After they bulldoze everything, there's a few plants that come up first, right? Those are your kind of weedy, woody grasses, a lot of things that like disturbed areas. Then a couple years later, your pine trees and your white oaks start coming up, right? And then those shoot up, and about 15 years later, you have a bunch of scrub things like yaupon, privet come up beneath them. Eventually, those oaks and pines will give way to hickories and other trees. And so the later stage succession of a forest in our area is an oak hickory forest, right? And you can eat acorns if you process them correctly, and you can eat hickory nuts. It's just, they're hard to get at, you don't get a whole nut. So whenever you have a place that hasn't been cleared in a long time, that's food. But also, whenever you have a place that is burned regularly, you have food. So a controlled burn will come through and it'll wipe out pretty much all of the hardwoods, and it'll only really leave the longleaf pines as tall plants, and you might have a few live oaks and things like that. But the beautiful thing about all of those hardwoods being cleared out is that you have space for herbaceous plants and forbs. So that's basically all of your stuff that gets about yay high. And it also, what it does is with things like sassafras, because sassafras can grow and become a tall tree, but if you burn it every year, one, it gets rid of a lot of the blights that can affect sassafras, but two, it makes those leaves soft and tender every year. And then you can wrap your fish in them and smoke them. You can chew on those leaves, you can eat them as a salad green. They're one of my favorites, right? So many other things in our landscape are really made very productive by burning regularly. Another thing that people would do, though, historically, is that they would have very cross-generational breeding projects. One of the reasons that we use so much industrial agriculture is because the lifespans of a lot of our food crops are very short. So if you are growing corn, for instance, you can select for new genetics every generation, and every generation is a year. For a lot of our plants, we can actually get 5 or 10 growing seasons in a year. And that means that you have this very high turnaround on what you're going to be selecting for. So you can make bigger tomatoes really fast. You can make bigger, drier, longer stored form of corn really fast. But with a hickory tree does not hit its stride in production for usually about 80 to 120 years. Now, that's not to say they won't produce before that, but it is to say that is when they will give you the most bumper of a crop. So if you're trying to select for hickory trees to really figure out which ones turned out the best, you have to have an incredibly long cultural memory, right? Because you have to know, yes, so-and-so's grandfather, so-and-so, his grandfather planted that hickory tree from seed source that he stocked in this region, and the thing that he was trying to select it for was that it would be bitter whenever he first harvested it to keep other animals from it, but then later on, it wouldn't be bitter. And that is an actual cultivar that we know that indigenous peoples on the eastern coast had prior to colonization. They had a bitter nut hickory that was bitter when you harvested it and stopped being bitter after a month. Those genetics have disappeared from the landscape because we logged all of those hickory orchards. This land was a food forest prior to colonization. It was made of plants that had been selected across thousands of generations, literally between 10 and 40,000 years, depending on where you are in the Americas. People have been living in these areas. People have been here since before the last ice age ended. This ecosystem evolved with our actions, human actions. And now the reason that it's under threat is not because we are here, it is because we are not doing the things that we have always done. It's because we are not living as people here have lived. We're not doing our controlled burns, we're mowing our lawns, right? We're not traveling around and following the seasons of the harvest, right? We're living very stationary. We're not walking places and foraging and, basically cutting back things that don't have good genetics and planting things that do. We're driving everywhere, right? We have neglected our relationship to the landscape. But the genetics for a lot of these things are still there. So if you take persimmons, for instance, anybody had an American persimmon? I don't mean the Fuji ones you get at the grocery store, those are Japanese persimmons. But the nice American persimmon you find growing wild here, it's nice, it's orange or red, goes about that big around. The good ones taste exactly like Fruit Loops. The persimmon historically was used for a couple of different purposes. One was that it was used for its astringent qualities, astringent being drying. And that quality can be used in the tanning of leather to help soften the leather and also to help prolong the amount of time you can store it before you fully finish it, right? So indigenous peoples in this area, they had two primary groups of cultivars for persimmons. They had tannin persimmons, and they had eating persimmons. The tannin persimmons and the eating persimmons, when the indigenous people were removed from here, began to interbreed and to hybridize. So now you might have certain persimmons that taste really, really good, certain persimmons that taste really, really bad. But historically, you would have kept those separate, right? Those genetics are still there, though. A couple of generations of selecting for the better eating persimmons, and you can get better American persimmons than you'll ever find in the wild. Same thing with American beautyberry. They had the insect repellent beautyberries, and then they had the beautyberries that they actually ate, right? And they kept those separate. They kept the genetics separate, they had different cultivars. That is all still there. And then there are also a lot of other plants native to the Southeast that have never been cultivated. We have 5 species of wild olives. We have native wild onions. Many of you have had them, they only get this big. But the thing is that with our efforts, we can bring these things into cultivation. It will take generations in some cases. But if we want to build a world where people can live in this area in high density like we do now, if we want to build a world where our descendants spend less time at the grocery store and more time on land, if we want to build a world where we survive climate change as a species and where our ecosystems survive alongside of us, that means that we have to develop local food systems. That means that we have to develop ways of living off the land near us. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't live in ecological luxury. It doesn't mean that we necessarily have to have less. But it does mean that we have to change our priorities. We can improve hickory trees and put one in everyone's yard. We can send teams of people out to harvest those. And then we can invent industrial processes to make hickory nut milk. We could choose to provide that for free to people, right? These are things we could do as a society. For the price that they are building the new I-10 bridge, you could create a food system in the Southeast sustainable for all of us, right? It would take time. The things that you plant now will not feed you now. The hickory trees that I harvest off of were planted or at least not cut down for generations, and that's why I get to use them. We get to make decisions about how our future looks. You can choose to be scared. We can choose to think that we are doomed. And as long as we do choose that, we will be. But if we do the work, we will be okay. Our ecosystems are really, really cool. They can survive a lot. Earlier I said that we have 10,000 species of plant in Alabama, and we have 5,000 native and 5,000 invasive. Well, you know what's interesting about that is that all of those native plants are actually still here. They have been competing with just as many invasive plants that we have selected for them, we have brought here, that we have prioritized, and those native plants are still here, right? That is a triumph of resiliency. We can make them more resilient with our own actions, right? There is stuff we can do. And I think that that's really, to me, the most important thing, is that it's not hopeless, but you do have to do the work. No one is going to do it for you, and no one can. No government agency can come in and fix all of these problems for us. No billionaire can come in and save us, because we have to actually change the way that we live. We have to actually learn these things ourselves. Those types of programs will only be useful insofar as that their resources were put towards teaching you how to do things and giving you what you need to do it, right? Okay, I think I'm about done. Does anybody have any questions about native plants? Does anybody have any questions about native plants in the food system? Anything? Yeah. So the Three Sisters gardening, as we typically think about it, is corn, squash, and beans. That was initiated, so squash was cultivated first in basically this area, a little bit north of us. And squash has been in cultivation for at least 12,000 years. It's the oldest evidence that we have, but typically whenever you have the oldest evidence, it's probably a little bit older than that, so people tend to think 14,000 to 15,000 years. Corn has been in cultivation for about 6,000 years. Corn was first cultivated in Central America. So when we talk about native plants, corn's kind of we call it a range expander. but it's not invasive. We can get into that a little bit too. And then the other thing that you use is a climbing bean. And so lima beans are actually native here, and there are lots of other beans, woolly beans, and that is your traditional Three Sisters. Like I said, they did add a lot of other plants to it in a lot of different places. Yeah. As far as, one thing I actually want to say is like, the definition of an invasive plant versus a native plant versus a naturalized plant. So a native plant is a plant that is from here and has lived here for a long time. A native plant cannot be invasive. They can be aggressive, they can spread a lot, but invasiveness is defined by a plant's ability to displace native species, and is also defined by it arriving as a result of colonization. So if something was brought here by indigenous people in small numbers, 7,000 years ago, we consider that a native plant because people are a part of the Earth's ecosystem, right? When we start to consider things invasive, it's really because they are playing a role in like the colonization of land, right? Whenever you have thousands of species being brought over right at the same time. The very first things that were brought over from Europe, a lot of them didn't become invasive because they had about 100 years before that next wave of plants got brought over, and our ecosystems were able to incorporate them. Similarly, like the coconut landed in Central America about 10,000 years ago, and it's not invasive. It made its way there on its own, and it doesn't displace other things. So I just wanted to go ahead and make that clear, so there's some confusion about that. Were there any other questions?
What's the book you recommend for native plants?
It depends on what you mean. Like, if you're looking for identification, Sam Thayer's guide is hands down the best thing that you're going to find. We have a copy of it up there that you can look at, but you can't take home. If you want an identification book, we do have a couple more up there that show you the 100 most common plants at one of our preserves. Not our preserve, one of the state's preserves. And if you just want to learn about ecology, I honestly recommend starting with Braiding Sweetgrass, not because it'll teach you the most about plants, but because it'll put you in the right headspace when you learn everything else about plants. I would say get out your phone, download Seek, download iNaturalist, identify everything that you see. Look it up, verify it, never believe what an AI tells you. But those identification apps can be really helpful to just start kind of breaking the green wall of blur that defines the settler non-relationship of nature, And if you want to learn more than that, honestly, I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I also really respect Doug Tallamy. Doug Tallamy's work on oaks and things like that. It's a really beautiful place to kind of put your energy. Were there any other questions? Nope? Okay. Well then I will get out of your hair.